Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged. I'm your host, Roberto Mazza, and today my guest is Professor Howard Eissenstat. Howard is a Laurentian Associate Professor of Middle Eastern History and History Department Chair at St. Lawrence University in upstate New York, and non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. Howard's research focuses on intersection of nationalism, religious identity, and policy in the Turkish Republic. So today, as a last episode of 2024, we're going to engage in a conversation about the relationship between Turkey and Israel. We will also look at the relationship, or the upcoming relationship, between President-elect Trump and President Erdogan of Turkey, and how their relationship may also have an impact on the development of Israeli, Turkish, and of course, American relations. But before we delve into all of that, Howard, welcome.
Good to be with you.
So to start with, I would like to ask you to say something about yourself and your academic work.
I grew up in upstate New York. I was determined to get out of my city and worked very hard to. I think that's in effect why I started to study things international, and now I ended up right back in upstate New York after a 20-year interval, and I like it a lot better now than I did as a young man. My work is on Turkish nationalism and particularly the interweaving of religious identity and national identity. I also do work in sort of contemporary Turkish foreign policy, domestic policy. My career, I think, was in some ways defined by what was happening in Turkey. I was finishing up my dissertation with the rise of the AKP, and of course that was both informed my thinking about my research, and my research helped me to process what was going on in Turkey, and then I was very frustrated in 2003, 2004, and particularly afterwards, and the period between 2007 to maybe 2011, that there was this tremendous excitement about Erdogan and this idea of liberalization, and there was content there. There were ways in which Turkey was liberalizing, but I was frustrated because there was also lots of repression going on, and so I started to put a more public face on my research to try to address that, and I think that's really sort of colored that interplay between my scholarship on Turkish nationalism and my concerns about speaking to a wider public have really defined my scholarship ever since.
Now, we will talk about Turkey and Israel and politics indeed, but given we are recording the day after the passing of President Carter, I wanted to ask you about your views on his legacy in relation to the Middle East and Palestine in particular.
So there's obviously Carter had this very long career post-presidency in which he played a very important role in calling attention to the plight of Palestinians for an American public, in which he played a very important role in peace negotiations around the world. But I think I think that there's a story in the Camp David process between Menachem Begin, Sadat, and himself that actually is important to remember, which is that the actual Camp David negotiations resulted in an expectation that Palestinian issues would be addressed, and that Palestinian self-government would be an outcome. But it was never spelled out concretely, and Begin basically ignored those components of the treaty thereafter. And I think that speaks to the ways in which the Palestinian national aspirations have been perennially talked about, but also sidelined. And I am certain that Carter felt betrayed by that, and clearly his work thereafter continued to highlight Palestinian needs. But it seems to me that the Camp David Accords really highlighted the extent to which Palestinians were not really able to take control of their own story, and that in the end, Arab states talk about Palestinian issues, but they're tertiary to their own state concerns.
Now, let me move to Turkey, since that's your area of expertise. So I would like to start asking to give the listeners a sense of the relationship between Turkey and Israel under Erdogan from the early 2000s to October 2023. And I know it sounds like a lot, but I believe it's important to see how this relationship evolved through time and changing context.
Okay, great. So I guess I would start out with the period, the 1990s, and the period up to the AKP's victory in 2002 and Erdogan ascending to the prime ministership in 2003, which is that the 1990s were actually sort of an aberration in Turkish-Israeli relations, in that they were unusually warm and unusually cooperative, and that spoke to the role of the military in defining foreign policy. It spoke to its determination to have a cutout for security policy that was not beholden to the Turkish public, and ran counter, I think, to what most Turkish citizens would have preferred. So when the AKP comes to power, there isn't a clean break for a good number of years. And I think part of that has to do with the AKP wanting to reach out to the West, and during those years, prioritizing this idea of Turkey as able to talk to all parties. It also, I think, reflected the AKP not feeling very secure yet in taking control of foreign policy, and so that the Davos conference in I think 2009 represents that it was a staged spat between Erdogan and Perez, and the point of it, I think, was to demonstrate that Turkey was now able to stand up to the West and to stand up to Israel, to stand on principles, there's a backstory to it in that Erdogan had tried to broker peace between Turkey and Syria and felt betrayed by the Israelis. But I think at a very basic level, 2009 was the emergence of Erdogan as a confident leader of Turkey's foreign policy, and begins a period of deep personalization of Turkish foreign policy. The bureaucracy is increasingly marginalized as political leaders take over, and particularly Erdogan's personal concerns and personal political fortunes take over. So that got us to 2009. I think what we've seen over the intervening years has been periods of cooler relations, periods of warmer relations, often sort of very noisy diplomacy on both sides. I think that Turkey and Israel find in each other convenient rivals for domestic political concerns. I think that they, up until this most recent conflict in Gaza, they were able to maintain trade relations pretty handily. So this is what we have right now is certainly the worst break. But I also think that it reflects on Erdogan's part. It reflects pretty strong personal feelings. What Erdogan is different from most Middle Eastern leaders on this issue in two respects. The first is that I think that he is much less cynical than many of his Arab equals in the way he engages with Israel-Palestine. I think that he feels the Palestinian issue really acutely. And secondly, because Turkey is, yes, a flawed democracy, it's typically just described as a hybrid regime. Popular public attitudes matter more in Turkey than they do in some place like Syria or Saudi Arabia or Egypt. And so there's the domestic advantages of standing tall, of making loud proclamations, of declaring, we might arrive on the beaches in the night. All that stuff. It plays to a Turkish electorate who feels the Palestinian issue really acutely, and I think it reflects the greater importance of electoral concerns in Turkey as opposed to Turkey's Arab neighbors.
I just want to add that I personally remember when I was living in Jerusalem, around the period that you mentioned, around 2009, the growing number of Turks roaming the streets of East Jerusalem, which I think it was a carefully designed policy to send Turks and show their presence visibly. I mean, I remember going to some coffee shops, and at some point, I hear people speaking Turkish, which I never heard before that point in time.
And I think that also reflects, another component of Turkey's foreign policy as the AKP takes control, which is it took the idea of soft power, of humanitarian aid, of development aid as a tool of foreign policy much, much more seriously. And I think that Palestine is reflective of that larger truth in the way Turkey has engaged with the wider world. I think it's telling that, Turkey is brokering negotiations between Somalia and Ethiopia right now. That's not something that Turkey circa 1994 would have been willing or able to do.
I don't want to put too much emphasis on October 7 as the day that changed the Middle East. Yet, it is certainly true that we have seen a new set of dynamics emerging, another changing course. Can you speak about the changes in Turkish-Israel relations after October 7?
So, I mean, there were significant breaks. Some of those were Turkey sort of doing the sort of public engagement that it's often done, but more serious this time because the Turkish public was so concerned by the level of violence and the clear war crimes that were being perpetrated in Gaza. And that required Erdogan, and this was not his first inclination, but it eventually forced him to cut off trade as well. There is one important element of trade that continues, which is Azerbaijani oil is still transferred. Oil and gas are still transferred to Israel through Turkey, and that's a point of domestic concern. It's one of the chief criticisms that Erdogan has gotten domestically. He has, I think, it's said something about his own balancing act that he's not been willing to alter that, and that the relationship with Azerbaijan is more important than any concerns that he has for the Palestinians. I think a lot has been made of Erdogan playing a role of a peace broker, but I don't think it's particularly meaningful. I don't think that Erdogan is able to play that role. It's not clear to me how much influence he has over Hamas. He certainly plays a larger role in supporting Hamas than most regional states do, but it's not clear to me how much leverage he really has over them, and he's simply not trusted by the Israelis at this point. So it's I think there's sort of I distinguish in Turkish foreign policy the noisy diplomacy from the quiet diplomacy. And the noisy diplomacy, things like trying to insert himself into Gaza, I think that those are mostly for domestic consumption, and probably because Erdogan feels good about them. The quiet diplomacy is what's really effective, and that takes a longer period of time and requires less grandstanding.
And actually, I wanted to pick up on something. So I recently interviewed Daniel Kurd, and we delved into Palestinian politics. So I was wondering to what extent Erdogan is involved in Palestinian affairs, because as you said, it doesn't really look to have a commanding relations with Hamas, at least.
Yeah, I don't think. I think that Erdogan feels the cause of the Palestinians on a very acute level personally. I think it's meaningful to him. I think it helps to define his worldview. I think the plight of the Palestinians informs his sense that the West are hypocritical, that the West is of declining importance. I think it informs his desire for a more multipolar world. I don't get the sense that he has thought very deeply about what a peace process would look like, whether we're talking about a one state or a two state. I don't. There is, I think, some degree of tension between his support of Hamas and his failure to condemn the violence of Al-Aqsa flood on the one hand, and the Turkish state's stated policy of supporting a two-state solution based on the 1967 borders. In other words, I think that he's somebody who feels Palestine very acutely, but I don't think he spends a tremendous amount of time thinking about it.
Is there a final goal in relation to Palestine that you think Erdogan has, or is just something that is moving along the developing context?
I think that for him, Palestine is an important part of this larger story of a movement to a multipolar world in which the West is decentered and in which Turkey can play a much more important role. And I think that his long-term expectation is that this multipolar world that he's envisioning, in which Turkey will play a leading role in, will also help move Palestinians towards justice and self-determination. I don't think that he spends an awful lot of time sort of thinking about what that would mean concretely. And that's probably true of most leaders. The actual process for moving forward concretely is really challenging and complicated, and I think is on a longer historical scale than many of these than politicians can typically think about.
Now, I am a huge fan of your tweets, and now you're on Blue Sky. We're all on Blue Sky. I don't even know how we should call tweets or something else, I guess.
I call them posts. I am an old man. I try to avoid new technologies and neologisms, so I simply call them posts.
Posts, yes. I guess that's the real name. And you provide often very much needed context and compelling analysis in a few words, which I think is very important, given the fact that many people just read, captions essentially. And I was wondering if you can speak about the broader role of Turkey, which you do often in your posts in the region, particularly in Syria, since the collapse of the Bashar regimes, and to what extent the role of Turkey may or may not influence Israeli politics and military choices.
Well, I guess I'll start by thanking you for the kind words about my posting, which, I mean, I post in part to help myself think things through quickly. I also I got into the habit of trying to move conversations, and so when however many people I have as followers, really the people I'm trying to talk to are other scholars and journalists, and trying to help frame narratives. I think that with regard to Syria, the first thing I would say is I think that Turkey, things have developed in Syria in ways that Turkey did not expect, but it is pleasantly surprised. It effectively, it bought a $2 lottery ticket and won big, or at least won big on the short term. Whether it can capitalize on that in long term is another story, and one that Turkey doesn't have a final say over. And in the end, the future of Syria will be defined by the Syrians. I think that right now, I think that Turkey has, in an odd way, done very well out of the horrendous violence that followed October 7th, 2023. It's done well because it has partnerships and rivalries with both Russia and Iran. Both Russia and Iran have been significantly weakened, and Turkey has been able to step in as a much more significant regional player because both Russia and Iran have been weakened. I think that there's tremendous domestic benefit to the end of the Syrian civil war if the Syrian civil war is in fact over. In that Turkey's refugee population has been a huge electoral drag on Erdogan. The weakness of the YPG of the SDF in Syria seems to be facilitating a new peace deal in Turkey between the Turkish government and jailed PKK leader Abdullah Öcalan. Turkey's in a good spot at the moment. I think, and Erdogan's in a good spot in the moment. I think that some of that is luck. Some of that is the messaging that Erdogan has done, the sort of noisy diplomacy that I cast aspersions on a moment ago. But they sound better right now than they would have otherwise. They sound like they're more resonant. I think that as well, we've seen Turkish moments before, and there's an awful lot that's not under his control. We don't know what the government in Syria is going to look like. We don't know whether it's going to be able to stabilize. If it does, Turkey will play a huge role in rebuilding the country, which is good for the Syrians and good for the Turkish economy as well. If it doesn't, then some of these things that seem like wins right now may be less so.
I want to briefly look at Iran and Lebanon, not area of expertise of both of us, but both fronts seem calm at the moment, perhaps a lull before the storm. And I want to go back to an article that you wrote. Actually, you wrote a section of a longer article co-written, with other scholars for the Middle East Institute last August. And essentially, you, with the others, were discussing the possibility of an all-out war. Are we now still close to an all-out war, or have things changed?
So I think that left to its druthers, Iran has clearly decided that it is not willing to risk its own survival as a regime to provide support for its proxies. Right? It didn't meaningfully intervene in support of Hezbollah. It didn't meaningfully intervene in support of al-Assad. So I think that there was a game of chicken between Israel and Iran, and in the end, it was Iran that flinched. So my concerns about a general war are lower now than they were, a year ago. That said, we have a new president coming in with some very hawkish figures, and I don't think that it's very easy to predict how President Trump's policies will unfold, and so I'm at this moment. I think that the risk of a general war in the Middle East is pretty slim. I can imagine the United States being overambitious, particularly with regard to Iran, and that sounding wildly optimistic 6 months from now.
So let me move to our side of the oceans, and I want to pick your brain on the upcoming transitions from the Biden administration to Donald Trump. So first, let me ask about the Trump-Erdogan relationship. What do they want or expect from each other?
So I think that their inclination is to come to deals. They are both transactionalists in the very narrow sense. I mean, all foreign policy is transactional, but all diplomacy is transactional. But they both take a very literal quid pro quo attitude towards these things. I think that they both distrust bureaucracies and are very much inclined to personalized relationships. I think that Erdogan has had a very good luck overall in manipulating Trump during his first term, and I think that Trump is much more determined in his second administration to not be limited by bureaucrats and experts. All of that speaks to better relations between Turkey and the United States, mostly in ways that I think benefit Turkey. I think whether they benefit the United States is probably a more complicated question, but Turkey is very likely to be able to act in Syria in the ways it sees fit if it works with Trump to do so. I don't think that the U.S. troops in Syria are likely to stay for another 4 years. It doesn't appear that Trump thinks that Syria is worth investing in, either diplomatically or militarily. I can imagine, arms deals going through much more smoothly under a Trump administration. But again, predictions can be challenging, right? There's some very hawkish figures in the Trump White House. Back in the day when I was lobbying for Amnesty International, Rubio's office was one of the friendliest offices when I came to talk about Turkish human rights violations. He's now going to be Secretary of State, and so has his opinions changed radically, or is he going to be a and a voice of concern for a brofest between Erdogan and Trump? I think it's very hard to predict.
And I want to add a footnote here, since you mentioned the question of bureaucracy, that the very notion of deep state was actually born in Turkey and then quickly used by Donald Trump. So it's very interesting also the kind of similar language and attitude towards the state apparatus and bureaucracy here. And as I asked my previous guest, I'm curious to hear what you think the major mistakes of the Biden administration in relation to Israel-Palestine have been, and if there's anything that may be saved.
Let me take the second part first, because Donna Al-Kurd, actually, you mentioned her previously. She came to visit SLU last year, and I picked her up from the airport, and we had this conversation about Gaza, and her argument, if I can simplify it, was that the level of violence has been so great, the trauma is so great that no negotiations was really possible. Now, I may be oversimplifying, and I should let her speak for herself. My response was, it was so broken that I think there's going to be a break in the way in which people think about the conflict and think about Palestinian rights. I see this in my students who, right, left, or center, are universally supportive of the Palestinians and really very critical of Israel. It's unusual for me to find anybody under, let's say under 30, who wants to make an argument for why Israel's policies are legitimate. So I think both Donna's pessimism and my sense of how things are changing I think they're both true, and I'm not sure how that works out in the long term. With regard to the Biden administration, I think that it would have been extremely hard for them in the first 3 months of the conflict to make a real break with Israel. And I think that's true not just because of the traditions of U.S. support for Israel and domestic political concerns, but also because U.S. allies around the world, I'm thinking of countries like Taiwan or the Philippines that are increasingly threatened by China. There are costs to not supporting allies, right? There are knock-on costs, and I think that both the type of violence that was perpetrated by Hamas on October 7th, and I think the sort of the international repercussions of that sort of more broadly for the United States as a global power, I think those were really significant. I think as it became clear that Israel's policies were absolutely criminal, as under the laws of war, as a succession of scholars and international organizations started to describe the conflict as genocidal. I think that the United States was obligated, both strategically and morally, to change tack, and Biden was unable to do that. I don't think it served U.S. interests. I don't think it served U.S. values. I actually think that there's an intersection between those, because the United States does have a vested interest in international law and international norms. I just don't see. I recognize that it would have been finding a way to be both supportive of Israel in its conflict with Iran and as an ally, and putting a hard stop on U.S. support for genocide. I think that that would have been challenging, but I also think that U.S. law could have was the lever by which to do that, because U.S. law prohibits selling weapons to and providing weapons to militaries that are engaged in war crimes. And however you want to I'm happy to have a long discussion about the application of genocide, but war crimes is a pretty straightforward and simple case.
When I look at the Biden administrations and having also a little bit of understanding and knowledge of Israeli society, I don't know, I found myself at times that really not being able to understand why would Biden and its administration being so supportive of what's happening. And at the same time, I try to kind of link with what you were talking about, and also Daniel Kurd was talking about, and other people I talked to about this deep trauma in Israeli society. And there must be something there that I personally don't get, but obviously that had repercussions on the war in Gaza. And also, I think it devalued then international law in the long run, since we saw the administration keep sending weapons. And I personally heard a lot of Israelis living here in the Chicago area essentially petitioning local politicians to say, that's enough. We need to stop this. And the only way we can do that is to stop sending weapons. But that didn't happen. And we know both the argument of then being labeled as anti-Semitic in the case you start using these arguments and try to restrain Israel.
Yeah, I think it's not the Jewish vote that's determinative here, right? Like there just aren't that many Jews in the United States. There are other factors at work in domestic calculations. I don't. In the end, I don't think it was domestic politics that resulted in this. I think that it was partially the inertia of a consensus around supporting Israel as sort of a basis for U.S. policy in the region, and I think that the generational divide between people who grew up, particularly people, older than 60, in which, the assumption is Israel's the good guys. I think that there's not a lot of knowledge about sort of the Palestinian story in the general public. I think it's well understood among sort of people who care about the Middle East more than glancingly, but it's not clear to me that that's true for the general public, and I think that Israeli society has transformed since the Second Intifada in ways that very, very few Americans who don't study the Middle East full time really have any sense of it all. Add to that the horrific violence of October 7th and the Israelis' effectiveness in communicating those horrors to U.S. officials. I have friends who've seen the videos that the Israelis produced, and they're just they're traumatic, and so yes, the Israeli society has been traumatized, but I think that people, Israel's interlocutors in the U.S. government were similarly convinced of that Hamas was an evil that needed to be eradicated.
Now, I have a couple of more questions about Israel-Turkey to wrap up our conversation, but there's one thing I want to ask about a new kid, let's call it now a little bit more politely, a new actor on the block, Elon Musk. In your view, can he play a role in the future of Israel, Palestine, and Middle East at large? I mean, we saw him essentially playing a major role in the past few days, claiming a role that he was not elected for, and yet he's out there essentially dictating new policies, new directions for the upcoming administration.
I don't have a lot of insights. He's clearly taken on a significant policy role. How long that lasts is anybody's guess. I can't imagine that Trump will want to share the spotlight for very long. But I also don't know what Musk thinks about Israel Palestine. It's his political vision isn't something I've spent a lot of time thinking about. I do imagine, though, that the Israelis are acutely aware that that's a potential lever for influencing the White House, and are doing their level best to influence him. And I think that goes. We talked about transactionalism earlier. At a very basic level, the Israelis are very good at thinking about transactional politics with the United States, and are likely to be thinking very carefully about how best to keep Trump on side. And unless there are, I can imagine the Gulf states intervening in significant ways to counterbalance that. But my expectation is that Israel is going to be offering lots of incentives for Trump to stay positive toward them.
I just asked because, Elon Musk visited Israel after October 7, and obviously there was criticism because, many say, well, you're allowing a lot of anti-Semitic activity on your platform. On the other hand, we also know about his investments in high tech connected with Israeli companies, startups. So obviously there's something there we are not aware of. And as you said, it's very hard to get actually a sense of a political vision of this man. And yet he's out there. I'd like to use this word pontificating, because I feel like he's becoming this new pope behind the president-elect. And I guess we'll all have to wait and see what's going to happen.
So I want to just rip off of something you said, which is that the criticisms of Trump or Musk for anti-Semitism and their dealing with Israel. Israel, I think, the Israeli government is actually quite okay with anti-Semitism abroad. And I think that's true for a couple of reasons. It's true, firstly, because I think it's an assumption of Zionism from the 1880s on that there is no long-term home for Jews in diaspora, and that eventually Jews in diaspora are going to realize this and get on the bus. And so, at some very basic level, anti-Semitism in the United States or anti-Semitism in Europe simply reinforces Zionism's own sense of itself as a necessary outcome of the way in which people interact. I think as well, the sense is that if what's good for Israel is in the long term what's really good for the Jews, and that diaspora Jews are in a sense truncated Jews. They're not fully formed because they haven't gone to Israel. They haven't self-actualized. And again, this goes back to Lev Pinsker. Like, this goes back to the 1880s. This sense that trying to assimilate, trying to engage with the rest of the world, the sort of the model of diaspora Jewry, that is a failed. It's a failed model, and it's a pathetic model. It's a model of weakness. And the actual the strong, the true Jew is the one who is in Israel. And so I think that there's not really a contradiction between Netanyahu cozying up to Orban or Musk or Trump and his sense of the role of Zionism in Jewish history.
As I said, I wanted to go back to the beginning of our conversations, focusing on Israel-Turkey, with the last couple of questions. So up until a year ago, actually more than a year ago now, scores of Israelis were normally visiting Istanbul and Turkey, and often in contrast to the official politics of both states towards each other. I think there were 7 direct flights between Turkey and Israel on a daily basis, all packed. Now, what do you think Israel really wants in relation to Turkey? So the other way around, to reopen diplomatic, commercial relations, to be more or less engaged in Palestine, or what?
I think that, and I have far fewer insights into Israeli policymakers than I do into Turkish policymakers. But my sense is that Israel's best case scenario is a return to the status quo prior to October 7th, in which trade, tourism continue apace, but that Israel will continue to see Turkey as a potential rival, as a country that, in the end, is not supportive of from the Israeli perspective, stability in the region. That it is, I think the Israelis really play up this idea that Turkey is allied with the Muslim Brotherhood, and so I think that a cold peace is what Israel is sort of sees as a best case scenario.
Now, as a last question, I want to ask you, your views on something that you hear often through the media, and obviously critics of Bibi Netanyahu who like to point out that Israel is becoming like Turkey under Erdogan. So do you think is there any room for analogy between the two leaders, Netanyahu and Erdogan?
I do think that there is a certain degree of populist borrowing transnationally that's occurring. And I think that we're seeing dynamics of new communication technologies and corporate control of media shifting the ways in which people consume the news and consume information, and I think that's sort of a universal truth. We assumed that things would become more democratic with more voices, and I don't think that's been proven out. So I've tried to answer your question without getting too deep into Israeli domestic politics, because I'm so acutely aware that there are people who know it much better than I do.
This was Howard Eissenstat, Laurentian's Associate Professor of Middle East History and History Department Chair at St. Lawrence University, and non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. Howard, teshekurler. Thank you so much.
Salin, it was great to be with you. Take care.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please share it with others on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Jerusalem Unplugged. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.